Hello and welcome to Healthcare Online, our special podcast for allied health specialist GPs. And our special guest is Damien Adler, co-founder of Power Diary. Hi, Damien. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you, Megan?
Very good, thank you. Now, if you're feeling like deja vu, folks, it is the second time we've spoken with Damien in probably as many weeks because we had such an action-packed conversation. Damien and I really had to put the brakes on hard. We covered what Power Diary can do, of course. We looked at improving the value that you offer to your team members to retain them without having to, go on that race to the bottom of constantly paying more and more. We looked at efficiencies to stream operations. We talked about no-show policies and the importance of running a practice that doesn't create practitioner stress. So that was a lot that we covered. So that was episode 14. So if anyone's interested in going back and having a look at that, it is where you are finding this one. So today we're going to cover part 2. We had such a long list. I mean, we were overly ambitious.
We were.
We're going to talk about the tension that I see so many practitioners, therapists and clinicians face when charging. That fear of charging, that creeping feeling of self-worth that comes in, that muddies the waters there, fair charging for the value delivered. We're going to be talking about NDIS charging and the changes that we've seen around that, diversification and going national, not just local. So Damien, what do you reckon?
I think we may have set ourselves an ambitious target again, but I think we can do it.
I love it. So let's start with that self-worth that comes up. Now, you and I have both been in this space a long time. You're a psychologist. You now got Power Diary. I've been in this space for 27 years. It is such a common conversation that I'm sure you have had it as well as I've had of, I can't possibly charge X amount. I am a healthcare professional. I'm in this to help the greater good. Money is dirty, evil, and wrong. My services should be free. So can you start with a reframe around that self-worth getting in the way of running a business?
Yeah. Look, I think the first thing to sort of pull up there is around this idea of the healthcare should be free, now, I happen to think it would be fantastic and I would actually support higher taxes and more directly paid for healthcare, right? Because I think healthcare is super important. But given that isn't the case and isn't, in the government, it's really at a government level to kind of fix that, right? That if there are people that struggle with accessibility and so forth due to costs, that's actually something that sits at a government level and we can do things via our associations and so forth on that. But it can't sit with the individual practitioner. And I think it's important that as practitioners, we kind of separate ourselves from that ideal and say, what is the reality of, where we operate, the context we operate, and then look at it realistically based on that, right? And not try, because it's impossible to do, right? It'd be an endless thing if you want to say, we're going to drop fees, we're going to make it super accessible, because we have a limited amount of time, essentially to sell, if we think of it in those terms. And therefore, the return we get on that's, what where most income is coming from, although, as we'll talk about, there's also other ways of expanding that. But we need to sort of separate those things out and understand that, yes, we operate in a system where healthcare is run as a business. We didn't create that scenario, but that is the reality we're in. And then we need to look at it clear-eyed and unemotionally like that. But I'd also go a step further too to say that when we're looking at how we charge, often you see people charging sort of unnecessarily discounted rates across the board to everyone, right? Which means that their charitable instinct is being sort of diluted by indiscriminate application of that, right? It's getting applied to across the board. It is much better in my mind, right, to charge what is fair and reasonable, which is usually a lot more than what clinicians subjectively feel that they should be charging or feel comfortable with, right? And have the people that can pay that. And then if you want to be altruistic and do some pro bono work or you can target that, right, at the I guess the population that truly is going to benefit the most from it, right? And that actually has a bigger impact, and it leaves it in the control of the practitioner because they can determine how much time they might want to dedicate to specifically, pro bono or heavily discounted work they want to. But those options are going to become available when the charging overall is at a level that you can run a healthy, financially successful practice and not be stressed out about money. Because if your practice is struggling and you're uncomfortable with raising rates and things like that, then your ability, your power to actually help those that might actually benefit is impaired anyway. So
not sustainable. I love that. I love it. I saw an example once, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. It was a GP practice. So I know you're predominantly in the allied health world. But it was a situation where they said, we have a $1,000 hardship budget a month.
Right.
So if anyone needs to bulk bill, we can draw from it. It's quite a big practice, a lot of clinicians. And then once that hardship budget is up, we actually cap it and say we've reached the limit on what the practice can sustain. We hold that over to next month. Have you seen examples like that, or, capped amounts that people have in their practice?
I haven't seen it as publicly done like that. And, it's a really interesting idea. But I've certainly seen a lot of people do that behind the scenes, right? Where they will look at, and in fact, one of the things you can do, like in practice management system, so in our system, you can sort of, classify like a patient type, and so you can run reports and go, okay, how many of these services are we running concurrently? And therefore you can keep like a really good eye on like what the ratios are of those things. But I think that the broader point that practice is doing, which is, the take home there, is making it a clearly defined thing that they're doing, and capping it so they've got a constraint on it, right? So that they're not compromising the success of the practice and the viability of the practice, but also, allowing themselves to provide those services in a way that, that reaches the people that really do need it and going to benefit the most.
Yeah, nice boundaries. So I have another thought for you. One of the most popular posts I've ever put on social media was along the lines of, what story are you telling yourself about your client's financial situation?
Yeah.
Because I'd had so many people say, my clients will never pay $200 an hour for a session. They can't afford it. They're all struggling. It's difficult financial times. My clients will not pay that.
Yeah.
And can you give us a reframe around, well, I know personally, I've had financial hardship in my life and a medical situation's come up and I've found that money. I reprioritize things. Like, that was my decision. That was my call. Reframe us, Damien.
No, look, I agree that this is a trap that people fall into. And I think we don't really truly know like the circumstances of our clients. And we also don't know how resourceful they are. And in the experience that like we had directly in the clinic, but we also see it when working with customers, that people are quite creative when it comes down to, so for instance, when we put prices up when we had our psychology practice, we would get people that we were concerned about that we might lose and whatnot. But it's amazing how, if they truly couldn't afford it, how other people will come, like so maybe family, it might be workplace. There's other often ways that people go, hey, I don't want that to just, to be discontinued. We'll support that. Or where people have been able to do simple things like we rearrange the appointment timing so it falls on a pay cycle and they get the rebate or whatever it might be applicable, and they do it. But so I think the idea that it's usually an anxiety that does not come into fruition in the way, like it does not manifest in the way that people think it will. They put the price up and it's going to be this mass drop off, right? I think that, that people have a way of prioritizing, the things that are important to them. And, there's some, it's interesting, like posts sometimes you see in different contexts, but they kind of will talk about like, people, for instance, that are smokers, right? And how even with all the tax hikes and all the costs, people have found a way to continue smoking, right? Which is, the, extreme example, sure, like when people are motivated, like, and, they can often find ways to do things. So I think it's somewhat of a distraction. We need to kind of go back to the core thing about what can I control? Well, I need to be able to run a practice that's sustainable, successful, and that sort of gives you the financial reward for the risk you're taking and your experience and the qualifications and so forth. let that be the kind of guiding principle there, right? And then, let other things fall where they do. But the other point that I would make is I think sometimes increasing prices, you can, more than losing existing clients, there can be a dip sometimes in referrals, right? Because before people have had a chance to experience the practice and value it, they may not, they may be put off. But the thinking goes that way. And I think there can be, that the more that you increase prices, this is going to appeal to a smaller group of people. There are hard limits, right? That eventually there will be some limit. It's usually way further out than what people think, but where it comes to. But think of it this way, like if you were to increase your charges by 25%, right? And let's say worst case scenario, you got 25% less referrals. You are still well and truly ahead, right? Because you are getting the same money, but you're only working 75% of what you are now, right? And so with that remaining 25%, you can do whatever. You can have fun and have better work-life balance if that's what you need. But you could also apply that to build other things that might generate income. So it might be you want to write the book. It might be to develop an e-course, for instance, that is going to provide ongoing recurring revenue to your practice. So even if there is a drop in referrals, that does not mean that you made a mistake in doing that. It's about assessing that and seeing where it lies. But dropping referrals and having more time to do other things, that's still a win.
Yeah, absolutely. A huge win. Now, I want to ask you a question about NDIS charging. And this is a whole can of worms. Yeah. So I'm more thinking from the angle that we have seen prices jump up in a big jump. I remember, 17 years ago when I first started this business, we had dietitians that couldn't survive as private practices. They weren't, because they were the max that they could charge. It might have been $80 a session. It was sort of like they were earning $60,000 to $80,000 a year if they went out and worked for themselves. There wasn't any rebate available. This was pre-EPCs, pre-mental health care, all of that. It was, if you want it, you pay for it. And the most you'll ever be able to get back on an appointment is through your private health. Yeah. No doubt you remember those days. You're much younger than I am, Damien. So you remember those days.
Probably not as much as you might be thinking.
So would you agree that one thing NDIS and other schemes have done is create a more fair playing field in pricing in terms of covering more of the hard costs and the realities in private practice? Tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best indication of this is when you look at what the professional associations have in terms of their recommended fees, right? Because they usually, I think, do a pretty good job of dialing into, roughly what their costs are, what's reasonable. They're looking across other industries and other comparable professions. And I don't always agree with where they land, but it's usually a much better job than what the individual practitioner does, right? In terms of assessing, their fees. And typically the recommended fees are much higher than what people feel they can get, they can actually get away with charging. Now, NDIS is, I think is better aligned, with the true cost of running these services. And I think to draw people, into private practice and make sure these services are available and to encourage people into the industry, and it needs to be viable and it needs to be a return on the effort, the education, and the risk that, goes with running, a practice and all the stresses that kind of go with that, right? So it's got to be that. So I sort of more see that price jump that we see, it's more actually of a correction, rather than it being something, distortion. Now we know that, okay, there are cases and there's certainly examples and there's things where, like anything where people do the wrong thing, right? And you see, NDIS has been, there's clear examples of where it's been, misused and there's been fraud and so forth. So let's put that kind of, aside and say, yeah, we recognize that needs to be dealt with. But overall, the fact that it, charges more and has sort of, that's not like, it's not out of the, the realms of what it actually costs to run a practice and to engage and provide a great, qualified, registered, service.
Yeah.
So I think there's that. The other, part of it to think about, I think, is that the actual compliance costs and the administrative costs around, the performing work under NDAs. They don't pay, for that. All that has to be covered by the fee that's being charged, for it. And a lot of it's hidden because, chasing out plans and making sure that things are aligned and the funding's there and it's tracking it. And I mean, it's a complicated piece of machinery there that needs to be managed. And if it goes wrong, it's the practitioner or the practice that wears it. Like the number of times people provided services and then, oh no, actually the plan was changed. That wasn't authorized. They lose all that, right? So you have to look at, I think, more, broadly or holistically about what's the total cost of providing services under the regime and what is, reasonable return, on that. So that's kind of my, hot take on that.
And it just always strikes me as really funny that we have these more emotionally charged conversations around pricing for a health practice. If this was another type of professional service, an accounting firm, legal firm, architect, it wouldn't have that emotional charge to it. It would be, in this hourly rate, we are keeping the lights on, paying for stamps, paying for carpet washed every year, paying for fire extinguishers. It is such a fact-based business as those other professional services. But when we say health practice, well,
that's right. Well, if you look at the legal profession, and you look at the charges, that you see where, we'll get a bill for whatever our, council has done, and you look at some of the charges on there for things like photocopying, and you're like, what? You got someone handwriting this stuff? But that's what do you do? That's it. I think in health, that's right. And it's a combination of things where community expectation is one thing, and then the various other people that get into healthcare, obviously, are typically motivated, to help others and altruistic and want to make a positive, impact. So you put those two things together. But my sort of take goes back to that thing about the government. If the gap is too big between rebate and speak to the government, speak to your local representative, right, about increasing the funding available. If it's a Medicare rebated service, about increasing the rebates. If it's not a Medicare rebated service, but should be, then talk to your local representative and make it an issue, right, with them, because that's really where the change, will sort of come about. I think that the government will fund without, I won't go on too much of a tangent here, but the government, you think about what they will spend on medication, right? Subsidizing medication and some of these biological interventions, which, okay, great. But actually, if we did some preventative work, or we did that in the allied health setting, we can see in the research that we're going to get an economically good outcome as well as a good health outcome. It's not a thing. So it's all about, though, making sure that where there are those things, we point the energy and the heat and the concern in the right direction. It shouldn't be at practitioners, and it shouldn't be on practitioners turning it on themselves and feeling, but turn on to the government of the day and hey, make it an issue. And enough people do that, that's where change comes about.
Wow. Okay. So I could listen to you talk about this for ages, because sometimes I don't have the words, and I hear the tension from people, bringing up these issues over and over again. And I think, why does it have such a different feeling to it than other businesses? But I really like how you brought together all of those factors. The altruism is such a big one. So we're not having a go at anyone. We're just
we're not. Total.
And in terms of growth, and this is our last kind of conversation path that we're going to go down, is I've often thought, I've seen practices over the years exposed to high risk. I had practices that I worked for affected by bushfire and, had to close completely. Other practices affected Lismore floods, closed completely. And all of these different horrible situations that happen over a long period of time I didn't realise, leading me down this path of healthcare courses and especially with COVID, what is going to sustain the practice if one of these big impacts hits? And some of these things are highly unlikely. But what's your thoughts, Damien, on diversifying so that you don't have all of your eggs in one basket, so that if 4 other physios open in the same street, you aren't, basically run out of business? Tell us your thoughts about that diversification thinking to drive sustainability of the practice.
I'm a very visual person, right? Like in how I think. And so the way that I think about this like diversification is almost like the foundations that are holding up a building, right? So we think of the sort of like imagine a building kind of on stilts. You're in Queensland, right? So
Yep, plenty of that.
Okay, right, exactly. So if we think about like a building being held up by stilts, so diversification is really like how many like stilts, how many posts are holding up that practice. So in the worst case scenario, you have one center one, right? That might seem pretty strong, right? But one, and that's where you have businesses that have sort of one modality, on premises, maybe even solo practitioner or quite, limited, and one type of client group, right? And that might be a thriving business on one level, right? Because that might be, but it is still one thing, and anything kind of impacts that, right? And takes that out for whatever reason, could be all the things that you mentioned or something we didn't see coming like COVID. Then that whole practice becomes very, is that the thing that's holding up, that gets taken out, the practice topples over, right?
Yes.
So each of each pillar that we can put in place, they don't all have to be equal strengths and equal priorities, but having a multitude of things that are kind of keeping the practice, supporting the practice means that the importance of any one of those is then reduced, and it makes the practice far more versatile. So when we think about things like online courses, when we think about expanding to doing telehealth, right? When we think about expanding to have other people potentially providing services, employing or engaging other people in the practice. So diversifying those kind of income streams, then if something happens to any one of those things, then the rest is there to kind of support it. And it was, in fact, even with our own psychology practice, we built it up to be fairly large, and it was psychology. And Medicare was the sort of dominant thing, and a lot of practices were sort of solely focused on Medicare. And we took a decision early on that we would expand out. We would still have, we used to call Medicare the bread and butter. Okay. It was sort of like a primary, support, but still government funded. It was the early days of Medicare, so subject to government change, which actually did happen. They reduced it from 18 maximum down to 10 sessions under psychologists. But we also nurtured relationships with local organizations, nonprofits. We did a lot of corporate work. We did picked up EAPs. We did a whole bunch of other things so that if something fundamentally changed with, say, Medicare or with particular modality, we would have other sort of supports that we already had the relationships built. We already had income streams, and we could sort of turn them up if we needed to. So doing training for sort of NGOs, government, and really sort of larger companies. If we needed to, we could dial that right up, right? And become like a training organization if we really had to, and pivot, right? So, each industry will be different in each context, but when you sort of sit down and think about it and you can draw it out, here's my practice, here's my foundation, what's holding it up, right? Now, if it's just me, like, if it's one practitioner, like, okay, so what can you do to kind of shore that up? It may even be things like making sure actually you have income protection insurance, right? To shore that, because when you look at it from a risk sort of assessment management point of view, you might think, okay, maybe some of these things I don't want to do, but I do need to shore up a few of these things from an income point of view. It can be things like insurance, but if we're thinking practice-wise, it could be all the other things as well. Like we've had practices with Powder that we've been around for a long time now, and so we've seen a lot of stuff happen over the years. We've seen people flooded out, whole regions just flooded, gone, right? We've seen practices that have burnt down. We've seen practices that have been broken into, things like that. We've seen, unfortunately, of course, you see practitioners pass away, that are running, and getting ill. So you can see the resilience often comes down to how many other things that kind of have in place that support it. And the ones that are, well positioned, they sort of sail through a lot better than, of course, ones where it's a solo support, something takes that out, and then they're in real trouble very quickly.
Yeah, so well said. I love your stilt analogy, especially the Queenslander reference. It's so true. Like, take it out. What legs are you standing on? Literally.
Yeah.
Years ago, and this is kind of our. I'll start wrapping this up because we've got to be good today.
Okay, sure.
But I did have a situation. I'm sure I've told you about this quite a few years ago. There was a big practice in a regional area, quite a specific area of physiotherapy. And then, four senior physios in that practice left and popped up in the area. So we went from one big one to then 5 practices with a not enough client base in that drivable area. So there's all sorts of things that weren't great about that situation. But something that really stuck in my mind from seeing that, and each one of them rang me and said, we need marketing help. And I was like, major conflict of interest.
Yeah,
You've got the one that you actually just left. How is your restraint of trade? Anyway, separate conversation for another day. But something that just stuck with me forever was, if you don't have enough clients in your local drivable area and you want to niche down in a particular, space, then sitting there and going, well, I've only got 3 clients this week, there it is not enough to keep the doors open. So telehealth and what you mentioned, and even choosing your niche but thinking of it nationally, I've always been a huge advocate of. Tell me your thoughts on thinking beyond that drivable area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to put even more to that, it really surprised us actually in COVID, right? Because when we were sort of assessing or looking at things, we were thinking, I'm sort of looking at it and go, okay, I can see obviously mental health, psychology, counseling, that's going to pivot online pretty well, right? But we were more concerned about the physios and massage therapists, but the ones that were in the very tactile kind of, experience, and you think, how's this going to play out? And that, a customer group that we were definitely concerned about in terms of their well-being. What was amazing, is to see that under the pressure of that, right, how creative people were, and it was amazing to see that, they tried things outside their comfort zone, rethought about what they're delivering, right? What is the core active ingredient in what they're providing, right? And so with a physio, or an osteo, or where you'd think surely it's very tactile, but then they were able to pivot to demonstrating exercise and doing more video content, being able to deliver services or tangential things, right? Which, I wouldn't, if I sat there and tried to brainstorm it, I wouldn't have come up with that, outside of the real need to do it. And then it was really inspirational to see these, and talk to these different practices that they'd worked out how to pivot, right? So that was under, it's the necessity is mother of, invention type thing. Yeah. But we can think about that outside of, a crisis and go, what is out, if you've got a situation like that, you're geographically isolated, or often we'll see someone, a health practitioner is in an area where there aren't many patients, but they're there because their spouse has got a job that requires them to be there, and they're sort of a little bit stuck. But you think about that, expanding outside of that, it can work so well. And I think it's that going outside your comfort area or what you're comfortable with, what you're used to, I could say, that's often very, we can do our core stuff without really thinking, it's kind of easy enough. But kind of going, what could I do, or what would happen if I absolutely needed to? What other services could I provide? And it works so well, and better than what, because often people find when they think that, they kind of have to think about what they really enjoy, and what they really, and have a whole different way of delivering it or packaging up what they do. So, no, all for it. And I think, this is the beauty of the technological age that we're in too, that you can have, you can have a satellite and get Starlinks, you can be in the middle of nowhere running on solar and batteries, right? Have a wonderful internet connection coming from satellite, and you can operate. You can run your health practice, on the side of a mountain if you want, and that's that's unique in history, of course. So I think it's exciting, and it leads to more robust practices.
Yeah, so good. You made me think of a physio practice that had locked up at home, back locked up too. Guess where you can go? You can come and see us during COVID. Come in for a release, an assessment, and a chat, and most importantly, a chat with a human being. I thought you did so clever.
Right? Yeah. Pivot. pivot to it, and away you go.
Mobile mani-pedi from the podiatrist. Anyway, that's getting into, I'm going to get a backlash for saying that. Damien, thank you so much for such a great conversation. I love the fact that we fundamentally talked a lot about emotional responses to money. In a way, seemed to be our theme for this chat, which is going to be so helpful for so many people. Where can folks go and find out more about Power Diary? You've got a free trial as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You can jump onto our website, powerdiary.com, and start a free trial. We've also got our team members there that you can jump on a chat or book a call in with them, and we can help out any way that we can, help automate your practice. And away you go. Been around for a lot of years now. It's been like these sort of conversations and helping people with these sorts of things. I mean, it's really what I love doing. So thank you very much for having me on. It's been fun as always.
Absolute pleasure. Money Talk with Damien. We can start our own ABC radio. Look out. Thanks, Damien. Really appreciate your wisdom, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Megan.
Bye.
Bye.